The discovery of the black eggs. Farmer Jacob Reynolds had spent his entire life on his family's farmland, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Kentucky. The farm, handed down for generations, was a labor of love that had seen better days. Once a thriving egg and poultry business, it had now become a place of struggle. Jacob, a man in his early 40s, spent long days caring for his chickens, tending to crops, and managing a budget that seemed to shrink by the day. His farm, adorned with the memories of his ancestors, had always been his pride. However, rising costs, declining demand, and fierce competition from industrial egg farms had drained his savings. Every corner of his farmhouse and barn reminded him of the uphill battle to keep his family's legacy alive. On a crisp autumn morning, Jacob began his daily routine. He walked the perimeter of the property, inspecting the fencing for signs of wear and tear. His two faithful dogs, Max and Ruby, trotted beside him, their tails wagging as they explored the dew-kissed grass. It was during this routine walk that Jacob stumbled upon something peculiar near the edge of the woods, not far from his chicken coops. Among the golden leaves scattered on the ground, a cluster of dark shapes caught his attention. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the fallen leaves, until he realized they were eggs, but not ordinary ones. These eggs were unlike anything he had ever seen. Their shells were jet black, smooth as polished obsidian, and emitted a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in the morning sunlight. For a moment, Jacob stood frozen, his mind racing. None of his hens could have laid these. They were simply too different from the usual brown and white eggs he collected daily. Could these be snake eggs? He muttered to himself, a hint of unease creeping into his voice. Jacob scanned the area, searching for any sign of predators. No slithering creatures emerged from the tall grass, and the silence of the woods remained undisturbed. Curiosity overtook his initial hesitation. With a gloved hand, Jacob gently picked up one of the eggs and held it to the light. The black surface was unblemished and cold to the touch. The eggs didn't seem to match anything he'd encountered in his years on the farm. Jacob's practical side kicked in. What should he do with them? Leaving them in the open could attract predators, and he didn't want his dogs to disturb them either. But there was also a chance they were the key to something extraordinary. Could they belong to a rare bird or some other unusual creature? He decided to gather the dozen eggs carefully, placing them in a basket lined with hay. On his way back to the farmhouse, his mind buzzed with possibilities. If these eggs belonged to a unique species, they could be valuable. Perhaps their rarity would attract buyers willing to pay handsomely, giving his struggling farm a chance to recover. Once inside, Jacob placed the eggs in an old incubator he had used in better times. Dusting off the equipment, he adjusted the temperature and humidity settings, hoping they would mimic the warmth of a mother bird. He sat back and watched the eggs, their glossy black shells seeming almost mysterious under the dim light of the barn. The days passed, and Jacob made the eggs the center of his routine. He checked the incubator multiple times a day, ensuring the temperature was just right. His curiosity deepened with each passing hour, and he couldn't help but imagine the creatures that might emerge. Late one night, as he sat by the incubator with a cup of coffee in hand, Jacob allowed himself to dream. What if these eggs were a gift from fate? He pictured rare, exotic birds hatching from them. Birds so stunning that people would flock from miles around to see them. Maybe these creatures would give him a chance to compete in a market dominated by big corporations. But doubt was never far behind. What if these eggs didn't hatch at all? Or worse, what if they hatched something dangerous? Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a fine line between hope and folly. The incubator remained silent, the eggs still as stone. Jacob's days were filled with a mixture of anticipation and unease. Yet, as the weeks wore on, he noticed a peculiar change in his demeanor. Despite the hardships of farm life, he began to feel a glimmer of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. One frosty morning, Jacob was inspecting his chickens when his neighbor, an elderly man named Walter, stopped by for a visit. Walter was a lifelong farmer and something of a local legend for his knowledge of rare plants and animals. "What brings you by, Walter?" Jacob asked, motioning for him to come inside. "I saw the light in your barn late last night. Thought I'd check in on you." "Everything all right?" Walter's sharp eyes scanned the farm, taking in the neatly arranged coops and the unmistakable signs of wear and tear on the fences. Jacob hesitated, unsure if he should share his secret. Finally, he relented, leading Walter to the barn and showing him the black eggs. Walter's eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, leaning in for a closer look. "I've seen a lot in my time, but I've never seen anything like these. Where'd you find them?" Jacob explained the discovery, and Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Could be something special, Jacob, or it could be trouble. Either way, you've got yourself a mystery here." Walter's words stayed with Jacob long after his neighbor left. The farm's future now seemed intertwined with the fate of these strange eggs. Would they be the miracle he needed, or the start of something he would regret? As the weeks dragged on, Jacob's patience was tested. The eggs remained unhatched, their dark shells mocking his hopes, yet he couldn't bring himself to abandon them. Something deep inside told him they were worth the wait, even if he didn't fully understand why. Little did Jacob know, the day the eggs hatched would change his life, and his farm, forever. Waiting for the unknown. The first frost of winter arrived, painting Jacob's farmland in a silvery sheen that glittered under the pale morning sun. Life on the farm trudged forward, but Jacob's thoughts remained tethered to the black eggs resting in his barn. Every day, he repeated the same routine. Adjusting the incubator, checking the eggs for any sign of movement, and scribbling notes into a leather-bound journal he kept by his bedside. Weeks had passed since he first discovered the eggs, and his initial excitement was slowly being replaced by an ache of doubt. Were the eggs viable at all? He'd done everything right, but still, no cracks, no sounds, no signs of life. It felt as if he was staring into the void, waiting for it to blink back. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob sat by the incubator with Max and Ruby lying at his feet. The dogs, usually restless and playful, seemed subdued, as if they too sensed the weight of the mystery. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, which was beginning to gray at the temples, and leaned back against the wall of the barn. "I must be losing my mind, waiting for something that might not even happen," he muttered. His voice echoed faintly in the quiet barn. He had told no one else about the eggs except Walter. It wasn't just a matter of privacy. He feared the ridicule it might bring. The local farmers already saw Jacob as a relic of a bygone era, a man too stubborn to adopt modern methods or sell his land to developers. If word got out that he was staking his hopes on a dozen strange eggs, he'd be the talk of the town for all the wrong reasons. The following morning, Jacob awoke to an unsettling noise outside. A rhythmic tapping, faint but deliberate, carried through the stillness of the early dawn. He bolted upright, his heart racing. Max and Ruby were already alert, their ears perked and their eyes fixed on the barn door. Jacob threw on his coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into the icy air. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered wood glowing faintly under the moonlight. The tapping continued, steady and persistent, like a heartbeat coming from the other side of the walls. Pushing the barn doors open, Jacob was greeted by silence. His breath came out in frosty puffs as he scanned the room. Everything was as he'd left it, except for the incubator. A single egg had shifted slightly, its position no longer perfectly aligned with the others. His heart leaped. He rushed to the incubator and leaned in close. The egg that had moved showed no visible cracks, but as he pressed his ear against its smooth surface, he swore he heard something faint, a faint tapping, almost like a distant drumbeat. "They're alive," Jacob whispered, a smile breaking across his face. The realization renewed his energy. Over the next few days, Jacob threw himself into caring for the eggs with a devotion that bordered on obsession. He triple-checked the temperature and humidity, ensuring the conditions were flawless. He even stayed up late into the night, watching the incubator with an intensity that made his eyes burn. But as the days passed and the tapping sound faded, Jacob's elation gave way to concern. Why hadn't the eggs hatched yet? Was the tapping a false alarm, a cruel trick played by his own ears? His hope began to waver, and a familiar unease crept back into his mind. An unexpected visitor. Late one afternoon, as Jacob was feeding his chickens, he heard the distant hum of an approaching vehicle. He straightened up, squinting toward the road, and saw an unfamiliar black SUV kicking up dust as it rolled toward the farmhouse. His farm didn't often get visitors, and he wasn't expecting anyone. The SUV came to a stop in front of the barn, and a man stepped out. He was tall and sharply dressed, his black coat contrasting with the pale landscape. Everything about him screamed city slicker, too polished, too clean for the dirt and grit of farm life. "Good afternoon," the man called, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Jacob Reynolds, I presume." "That's me," Jacob replied, his brow furrowing. "Who's asking?" The man extended a hand. "Dr. Victor Graves. I'm a biologist specializing in rare and unusual species. I was told by your neighbor, Walter, that you've come across something unique." Jacob's stomach sank. Walter had been the only person he trusted with the secret of the black eggs, and now this stranger was standing on his property, asking questions he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. "Not sure what you mean," Jacob said cautiously. "This is just a regular old farm." Dr. Graves smiled, but there was something calculating in his eyes. "Come now, Mr. Reynolds. Walter mentioned some unusual eggs you found. Black, if I'm not mistaken." Jacob hesitated, weighing his options. On one hand, Dr. Graves might have answers, perhaps even solutions. On the other, there was something unsettling about the man's demeanor, something that made Jacob want to shut the barn doors and send him on his way. "I found some eggs," Jacob admitted finally, keeping his tone guarded. "What of it?" Dr. Graves's smile widened. "I'd like to see them, if you don't mind. I might be able to identify the species and help you understand what you're dealing with." Jacob thought about it for a long moment. He couldn't deny his own curiosity, and if anyone could shed light on the mystery, it would be someone like Graves. With a reluctant nod, he led the man into the barn. When Graves saw the incubator, his expression shifted. His professional composure faltered for a split second, replaced by something Jacob couldn't quite place. Excitement? Greed? Whatever it was, it made Jacob's skin crawl. "Fascinating," Graves murmured, leaning in close to inspect the eggs. "Absolutely fascinating. These are remarkable. I've only read about specimens like these in old texts, and even then, they were thought to be myths." "Myths?" Jacob asked, his curiosity piqued despite his unease. "What kind of myths?" Graves straightened, his expression becoming serious. "There are legends, old stories passed down in certain cultures, about eggs like these. They're said to belong to creatures of great significance, sometimes revered as symbols of prosperity, other times feared as harbingers of disaster. Of course," he added with a dismissive chuckle, "those are just stories. Scientifically, they could belong to a rare bird species, perhaps one that hasn't been documented in modern times." Jacob crossed his arms, his skepticism growing. "And why are you so interested?" Graves's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I have a keen interest in preserving rare species. I'd be willing to compensate you generously for the opportunity to study these eggs in a controlled environment." Jacob's gut twisted. The offer sounded tempting, especially given the farm's financial struggles, but something about Graves's eagerness felt off. He wasn't ready to hand over the eggs, not when he still didn't know what they were or what they might become. "I'll think about it," Jacob said, his tone firm. "But for now, they stay here." Graves nodded, though his expression betrayed a flicker of disappointment. "Very well. But please, don't hesitate to reach out if you change your mind. I'll leave my card." He handed Jacob a sleek black business card, and climbed back into his SUV. As the vehicle disappeared down the road, Jacob stood in the barn, staring at the eggs with a mix of pride and unease. What had he gotten himself into? The first crack. That night, as Jacob lay in bed, the barn seemed quieter than usual. He had almost drifted off to sleep when a sharp sound cut through the stillness. It was faint but unmistakable, a crack, like the snapping of a twig. He bolted upright, his heart pounding. Throwing on his coat, he grabbed a lantern and rushed to the barn. As he approached the incubator, his breath caught in his throat. One of the eggs had cracked. The first hatchling. The cracked egg sat in the incubator like a revelation. Its jet-black shell, once flawless and impenetrable, now bore a delicate fracture running along its surface. Jacob stood motionless, the lantern in his trembling hand casting a soft glow over the incubator. He could hardly breathe as he stared at the egg, waiting for another sign of movement. The barn was eerily silent except for the faint tapping from within the egg. It was slow and deliberate, as if the creature inside was gathering its strength. Max and Ruby had followed Jacob into the barn, and now stood at his side, their ears perked and their bodies tense. Even they seemed to sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. Jacob pulled up a stool and sat by the incubator, his eyes never leaving the fractured egg. Time seemed to stretch and blur as he waited, the minutes ticking by like hours. He leaned forward, his face mere inches from the incubator. When he saw it, the tiniest sliver of a beak poking through the crack. He gasped, his heart racing. The beak was unlike anything he had seen before. It was sharp and glossy, the same deep black as the shell, with a faint iridescent sheen that shimmered in the lantern light. The tiny creature inside let out a faint chirp, a sound so delicate and haunting that it sent chills down Jacob's spine. Slowly, painstakingly, the chick worked its way out of the shell. With each push and peck, more of its body emerged. Its feathers were sleek and black, but as they caught the light, they shimmered with shades of green and violet, like the surface of an oil slick. When the chick finally freed itself, it collapsed into the straw bedding, exhausted but alive. Jacob reached out cautiously, his hand trembling as he gently scooped up the tiny creature. It was warm and soft, its rapid heartbeat pulsing against his palm. The chick opened its eyes, and Jacob felt his breath catch in his throat. Its eyes were an otherworldly shade of silver, almost glowing in the dim light. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jacob whispered, his voice filled with awe. The chick let out another chirp, this one louder and more confident, as if to affirm its presence. Jacob couldn't help but smile. He cradled the tiny creature in his hands, marveling at its beauty and resilience. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope, a glimmer of something brighter than the struggles that had defined his life for so long. The hatchery awakens. Over the next 2 days, the other eggs began to follow suit. One by one, the shells cracked open, revealing more chicks, each as extraordinary as the first. Jacob was there for every hatching, watching with rapt attention as the tiny creatures fought their way into the world. Each chick was a masterpiece of nature, with iridescent feathers and glowing silver eyes that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom. By the end of the week, all 12 eggs had hatched. The barn, once a quiet and lonely place, was now filled with the soft peeping of the chicks and the rustling of straw as they explored their enclosure. Jacob had built a special pen for them, complete with heat lamps and fresh bedding, ensuring they were safe and comfortable. The chicks grew quickly, astonishingly quickly. Within days, they were larger and more robust than any other chicks Jacob had raised. Their feathers thickened, and their iridescent sheen became even more pronounced. They moved with a grace and confidence that seemed almost unnatural, as if they were aware of their own rarity. Jacob documented everything in his journal, filling page after page with observations. He noted their rapid growth, their unique physical features, and their unusually high energy levels. He also began to notice something even more remarkable. The chicks seemed to possess an uncanny intelligence. Unlike ordinary chickens, these chicks responded to Jacob's voice and movements with startling attentiveness. They seemed to recognize him, following him around the barn and chirping in unison whenever he entered. At times, Jacob felt as if they were watching him just as closely as he was watching them. The outside world intrudes. Word of the black chicks began to spread, thanks in part to Walter, who couldn't contain his excitement when he saw them for himself. Neighbors started stopping by the farm, curious about the mysterious birds. Jacob was reluctant to let too many people see them, but he knew he couldn't keep them a secret forever. One morning, as Jacob was feeding the chicks, he heard the crunch of gravel under tires. He turned to see another unfamiliar vehicle pulling up to the farmhouse. This time, it was a sleek black van, unmarked and ominous. Two men stepped out, both wearing suits and carrying briefcases. Jacob's stomach churned. He wiped his hands on his jeans and approached the men, his dogs growling softly at his heels. "Mr. Reynolds," one of the men asked, his tone formal but cold. "We're from the Department of Wildlife and Environmental Research. We've received reports about some unusual birds on your property." Jacob's heart sank. He knew this moment would come, but he wasn't ready for it. He crossed his arms and forced a calm expression. "They're just some rare chickens I've been raising. Nothing illegal about that." The second man smiled thinly. "We're not here to accuse you of anything, Mr. Reynolds. We simply want to examine the birds. If they belong to an undocumented species, it's our duty to study them and ensure their preservation." Jacob didn't like the sound of that. "These birds are mine," he said firmly. "I've put my blood, sweat, and tears into raising them. You're not taking them." The men exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. "We're not here to take them," the first man said, though his tone was less than reassuring. "But we strongly advise you to cooperate. If these birds pose any ecological risks, it's in everyone's best interest to handle this matter carefully." Jacob didn't respond. He stood his ground, watching as the men reluctantly climbed back into their van and drove away. But their visit left him rattled. He knew they'd be back, and next time, they might not be so polite. A turning point. As the days turned into weeks, the chicks continued to grow, their beauty and intelligence surpassing anything Jacob could have imagined. They became the centerpiece of his life, giving him a renewed sense of purpose. But the outside world was closing in, and Jacob knew he couldn't keep them hidden forever. One evening, Walter stopped by with a newspaper in hand. "Jacob, you need to see this," he said, handing over the front page. The headline read, "Mystery Farmer Raises Rare Black Birds. Experts Demand Investigation." Jacob felt his chest tighten as he scanned the article. It was filled with speculation and half-truths, but it was enough to draw attention to his farm. Already, reporters and wildlife officials were expressing interest in the story. "You've got something special here," Walter said, "but you need to decide what to do. People are going to come knocking, and they won't take no for an answer." Jacob stared out at the barn, where the black chicks were settling in for the night. They were more than just birds to him now. They were a symbol of hope, resilience, and the possibility of something greater. But the question remained, how far would he go to protect them? The storm approaches. The days that followed were marked by an unsettling mix of tranquility and tension. Jacob's farm had never been busier. The black chicks, now nearly full-grown, had become the stars of the property. Their glossy feathers shimmered with hues of green and violet in the sunlight, drawing admiration from the few neighbors Jacob allowed to see them. Yet, he couldn't shake the growing unease that shadowed his every move. The visit from the government officials, coupled with the newspaper article, had made it clear. His secret was out. One morning, as Jacob was tending to the birds, he noticed something strange. The chicks, usually energetic and curious, were unusually quiet. They clustered together in the pen, their silver eyes watching the sky. Max and Ruby, ever alert, were pacing near the barn, their ears pinned back and tails low. Jacob looked up, but the sky was clear, the air crisp and still. "What's got you all spooked?" Jacob muttered, stepping into the pen. The birds didn't scatter as they usually did when he entered. Instead, they remained huddled, their heads tilting slightly as if listening to something beyond his perception. A shiver ran down Jacob's spine. He knelt down, trying to soothe them, but their unease was contagious. It felt like the calm before a storm. The unexpected buyer. Later that afternoon, Jacob was repairing a section of the fence when a familiar rumble of tires reached his ears. He turned to see a sleek black car pulling into the driveway. This time, it wasn't the government officials. It was someone else. The car door opened, and out stepped a woman dressed in a tailored gray suit. She was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority. Her hair, tied back in a neat bun, seemed to gleam in the sunlight. "Mr. Reynolds," she called out, her voice firm but polite. "I'm Cassandra Moore, a representative of Atlas Biotech." Jacob set down his tools and walked toward her, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Atlas Biotech? What's that got to do with me?" Cassandra smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We're a research organization with a vested interest in rare and exotic species. We've heard about your remarkable birds, and we'd like to make you an offer." Jacob crossed his arms, his skepticism clear. "I've already had offers. Not interested." Cassandra's smile widened slightly, as if she'd expected his resistance. "I understand your hesitation, but I think you'll find our proposal compelling." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder, handing it to Jacob. He opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. Inside was a contract offering an astronomical sum of money, enough to not only save his farm but transform it into the most advanced poultry operation in the region. The catch: he'd have to sell the birds to Atlas Biotech, relinquishing all rights to their care and breeding. Jacob felt a knot form in his stomach. The money was tempting, but the thought of giving up the birds, his birds, felt like a betrayal. He looked up at Cassandra, his jaw tightening. "I'm not interested in selling them," he said firmly, handing the folder back. "They're not just livestock to me." Cassandra's expression remained calm, though her eyes hardened. "I admire your passion, Mr. Reynolds, but I'd advise you to reconsider. Offers like this don't come often, and there are others who might not be as generous." Jacob narrowed his eyes. "Is that a threat?" "Not at all," Cassandra replied smoothly. "Just a word of advice. Think it over." With that, she climbed back into her car and drove away, leaving Jacob standing in the driveway, his heart pounding. A mysterious event. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. The interaction with Cassandra had unsettled him, but it wasn't just her. The birds had been acting strangely all day, their usual energy replaced by a quiet vigilance. Even Max and Ruby seemed on edge, barking at shadows and patrolling the property with an intensity Jacob hadn't seen before. Unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, Jacob grabbed his flashlight and headed to the barn. The air was cold, and the only sound was the crunch of his boots on the gravel path. When he reached the barn, he found the birds clustered near the far end of the pen, their silver eyes glinting in the faint light. As Jacob approached, he heard it. A low, rhythmic hum, barely audible but unmistakable. It seemed to emanate from the birds themselves, a soft vibration that resonated in his chest. He froze, his flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the pen. "What in the world?" he whispered, stepping closer. The hum grew louder, harmonizing into a strange, haunting melody. The birds didn't seem distressed. If anything, they appeared calm, almost serene. Jacob crouched down, watching in awe as the glow in their silver eyes intensified, casting faint light on the straw-covered floor. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The barn fell silent, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Jacob waited, his breath shallow, but nothing else happened. After a few moments, the birds returned to their usual behavior, pecking at the straw and chirping softly. Shaken, Jacob retreated to the farmhouse. He couldn't explain what he'd just witnessed, But one thing was clear. These birds were far more extraordinary than he'd ever imagined. The intrusion. The next morning, Jacob awoke to the sound of Max barking furiously. He jumped out of bed and grabbed his shotgun, running outside to find the source of the commotion. Max and Ruby were standing near the barn, growling at a group of figures in dark clothing who were attempting to break in. "Hey," Jacob shouted, cocking the shotgun. "Get off my property." The intruders froze, their faces obscured by masks. One of them stepped forward, raising their hands in a gesture of surrender. "We're not here to hurt anyone," the person said, their voice muffled. "We just want the birds." Jacob's blood boiled. "You've got 5 seconds to leave before I call the sheriff, and I don't miss." The group hesitated for a moment before retreating, disappearing into the woods beyond the farm. Jacob watched until he was sure they were gone, then turned to Max and Ruby, giving them a reassuring pat. Inside the barn, the birds were unharmed but visibly agitated. Jacob secured the doors and reinforced the locks, his mind racing. Who were those people? Were they working for Atlas Biotech, or were they someone else entirely? And how had they learned about the birds? The decision. By the end of the day, Jacob knew he couldn't keep the birds safe on his own. He needed help. But from who? Walter? The local sheriff? Or perhaps even the government officials he'd turned away? Each option carried risks, and Jacob felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. That evening, as he sat in the barn with the birds, he made a silent vow. Whatever it took, he would protect them. These birds weren't just his livelihood. They were a miracle, a gift he couldn't explain but knew was meant to be cherished. As the sun set over the farm, Jacob began preparing for what he knew was coming. The world had noticed his birds, and it wasn't going to leave him in peace. A storm was brewing, and Jacob would have to face it head-on. The siege of the farm. The day after the intruders' attempted break-in, Jacob wasted no time fortifying the farm. His old family property, once a place of serenity and hard work, had now turned into a battleground. He reinforced the barn with heavy wooden planks, installed additional locks on all entrances, and rigged up rudimentary alarms using old cans and wire. His shotgun remained by his side at all times, and Max and Ruby, his loyal dogs, patrolled the property like seasoned sentinels. Despite his preparations, Jacob's heart was heavy. The black chickens, his miracle birds, had brought hope and wonder back into his life, but they had also attracted a world of trouble. The weight of responsibility for their safety bore down on him, and the question loomed. How much longer could he hold the outside world at bay? A community divided. Word of Jacob's extraordinary birds had spread farther than he realized. Over the next few days, strangers began showing up at the edge of his property. Some came out of curiosity, others with more dubious intentions. Among the crowd were wildlife enthusiasts, journalists, and even a few wealthy individuals who claimed they wanted to buy the birds outright. Walter, Jacob's neighbor and confidant, arrived one afternoon to help manage the growing commotion. "This is getting out of hand," Walter said, shaking his head as he handed Jacob a mug of coffee. "I counted at least a dozen cars parked down by the main road. They're not going to stop coming." Jacob leaned against the barn, exhaustion etched into his face. "I didn't ask for any of this, Walter. I just wanted to save my farm, and now I'm dealing with this." He gestured toward the distant crowd, their voices carrying faintly through the crisp air. Walter placed a reassuring hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You've got something special here, no doubt about it. But you need to figure out a way to handle this before it gets out of control." As the two men spoke, a woman from the crowd approached the edge of the property, waving a white handkerchief like a flag of truce. "Mr. Reynolds," she called out, "my name is Claire Harding, and I'm a journalist with the National Tribune. I'd love to talk to you about your remarkable birds." Jacob stiffened. "Not interested," he shouted back, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Please," Claire persisted. "If people knew your side of the story, they might understand. This could be your chance to set the record straight. Jacob turned his back on her, walking toward the barn. I've got nothing to say. Walter sighed, watching the woman retreat to her car. You sure you're doing the right thing, Jacob? The more you shut people out, the more curious they'll get. Jacob stopped in his tracks, his shoulders slumping. I don't trust them, Walter. I don't trust any of them. All they see is dollar signs. These birds deserve better than to be sold off or turned into someone's science experiment. A sleepless night. That evening, as darkness fell over the farm, Jacob's unease deepened. The crowd had dispersed for the night, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. He sat in the barn with the black chickens, their shimmering feathers reflecting the light of his lantern. The birds seemed unusually quiet, their silver eyes fixed on him as if sensing his turmoil. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts racing. He couldn't keep this up forever. The farm was his sanctuary, but it had become a prison, for him and for the birds. Suddenly, Max and Ruby began barking furiously outside. Jacob grabbed his shotgun and rushed to the barn door, his pulse quickening. He scanned the darkness, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the cold night air. Who's out there? He called, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. For a moment, there was no response. Then, from the shadows, a voice answered. We don't want to hurt you, Mr. Reynolds. Just give us the birds, and we'll leave. Jacob's grip on the shotgun tightened. You've got 5 seconds to get off my land before I call the sheriff. The voice chuckled. The sheriff. You think he'll protect you? People like us don't leave empty-handed. Jacob didn't wait for them to make the first move. He fired a warning shot into the air, the loud crack echoing across the farm. The sound sent the intruders scrambling, their footsteps fading into the distance. Jacob stood there for a long time, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. The unraveling. The next morning, Jacob was greeted by a new problem. The break-in attempt had rattled him, but now his phone was ringing off the hook. Reporters, government officials, and even buyers from overseas were trying to reach him. Each call brought more offers, some with astronomical sums of money attached. But no amount of money could ease the knot in Jacob's chest. By noon, Walter returned with a grim expression. Jacob, you need to see this, he said, handing over his tablet. On the screen was a news segment about the black chickens. The footage showed grainy images of the birds, likely taken by someone in the crowd outside the farm. They're calling it the miracle of Reynolds Farm, Walter said. And they're saying the government might step in if you don't cooperate. Jacob's hands clenched into fists. They can't take them from me. These birds are mine. I found them, I raised them, and I'll protect them. Walter hesitated. I get that, Jacob, but you're up against forces bigger than you. You need a plan, something that keeps the birds safe, but doesn't leave you fighting this battle alone. Jacob stared out at the barn, the weight of Walter's words settling over him like a storm cloud. He knew his friend was right. The farm was no longer just his sanctuary. It had become the focal point of a conflict he couldn't win on his own. A desperate plan. That evening, Jacob sat down at his kitchen table, his journal open before him. He flipped through its pages, each filled with detailed notes about the birds, their growth, their behavior, their unique features. He realized that the journal might be his key to preserving their legacy. After hours of thought, Jacob formulated a plan. He would reach out to a trusted contact at the local university, a professor of ornithology who had once visited his farm to study migratory birds. The professor, Dr. Eleanor Mathis, was a passionate advocate for wildlife preservation and someone Jacob felt he could trust. The next morning, he made the call. Dr. Mathis, Jacob began, his voice firm but weary. I need your help. Over the next hour, Jacob explained everything, the discovery of the eggs, the hatching of the birds, and the chaos that had followed. To his relief, Dr. Mathis didn't dismiss his story or express skepticism. Instead, she listened intently, her voice calm. and reassuring. "I'll come by tomorrow," she said. "We'll figure out a way to protect them. Jacob, I promise." A ray of hope. The following day, Dr. Mathis arrived at the farm, her eyes widening as she saw the birds for the first time. "Jacob," she said, her voice filled with awe, "these aren't just rare, they're revolutionary." She spent hours examining the birds, taking notes and collecting samples. Her expertise confirmed what Jacob had suspected all along. The black chickens were unlike anything documented in modern science. "These birds could change everything," Dr. Mathis said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Their resilience, their unique traits, it's like nature's perfection. But we need to act fast, if the wrong people get their hands on them." Jacob nodded. "That's why I called you. I need to make sure they're safe." Together, they devised a plan to relocate the birds to a secure research facility where they could be studied and preserved without exploitation. It was a bittersweet decision, but Jacob knew it was the right one. As the sun set over the farm, Jacob stood in the barn, surrounded by the birds that had become his lifeline. "You've given me hope," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Now it's my turn to protect you." The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Jacob felt like he had a chance to win. A new dawn. The day of the relocation began before dawn. A soft mist blanketed the farm as Jacob prepared to say goodbye to the birds that had not only saved his livelihood, but also reignited his spirit. Dr. Eleanor Mathis had returned with a team of trusted colleagues, bringing specialized equipment to ensure the safe transport of the black chickens. The plan was simple but delicate. Move the birds to a secure research facility under the university's jurisdiction, far from prying eyes and corporate greed. The final farewell. Jacob stood in the barn, watching as the team carefully transferred the chickens into custom-made crates lined with soft bedding. The birds, usually spirited and curious, seemed unusually calm, their silver eyes watching the activity with a quiet understanding. It was as if they knew this was necessary. Max and Ruby lingered by the barn doors, their tails wagging faintly as they followed Jacob's every move. Jacob crouched beside the dogs, giving each of them a reassuring pat. "It's for the best," he murmured, though the words felt heavy in his mouth. "They'll be safe." Dr. Mathis approached, clipboard in hand. "Jacob," she said softly, "I know this isn't easy, but you're doing the right thing. These birds are extraordinary. With the right care, their legacy will endure." Jacob nodded, his throat tight. "I just hope I'm not making a mistake." "You're not," Dr. Mathis assured him. "This isn't the end. It's a new beginning. For them and for you." The final obstacle. As the team loaded the last crate onto the transport truck, the sound of distant engines shattered the morning's peace. Jacob's heart sank as a convoy of vehicles approached the farm. Leading the pack was a black SUV. Cassandra Moore from Atlas Biotech had returned, and she wasn't alone. Behind her vehicle were two trucks carrying men in uniforms with the emblem of a private security firm. The convoy pulled to a stop just outside the barn, and Cassandra stepped out, flanked by several armed guards. "Mr. Reynolds," she called out, her tone sharp and commanding. "I see you've decided to move the birds. I'm afraid I can't allow that." Jacob stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You've got no right to stop me. These birds are mine." Cassandra's lips curled into a cold smile. "Technically, that's debatable. Under Section 47 of the Wildlife Preservation Act, any undocumented species discovered on U.S. soil is subject to government oversight. Until their classification is determined, their ownership is complicated." Dr. Mathis stepped between them, her voice steady. "You're twisting the law to suit your agenda. These birds are being relocated to a federally sanctioned research facility. You have no authority here." Cassandra's smile faltered, and she motioned for one of her guards to step forward. "Then we'll see what the courts have to say about that. But until then, I'm not leaving without those birds." Jacob's blood boiled. "You'll have to go through me first." The standoff escalated as the guards took defensive positions around the vehicles. Jacob's team, though unarmed, stood their ground, blocking access to the barn. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the threat of violence. The turning point. Suddenly, a sound broke through the standoff. A low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the barn. Everyone froze, their attention shifting toward the source of the noise. The hum grew louder, harmonizing into a hauntingly beautiful melody that sent shivers down Jacob's spine. Cassandra's guards hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. "What the hell is that?" one of them muttered. Jacob turned to the barn, his heart pounding. The birds. He rushed inside, followed closely by Dr. Mathis and the others. What they saw left them speechless. The black chickens were standing in perfect formation, their silver eyes glowing brighter than ever. The hum resonated from them, filling the barn with an almost otherworldly energy. Their iridescent feathers shimmered in the dim light, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that danced across the walls. "It's a display," Dr. Mathis whispered, awestruck. "They're reacting to the tension. This is their way of communicating." The sound grew louder, its vibrations so powerful that the air itself seemed to pulse. Outside, Cassandra and her guards retreated a few steps, visibly shaken. The hum was both beautiful and unnerving, impossible to ignore. And then, as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The barn fell silent, the only sound Jacob's shallow breaths. A change of heart. Cassandra stepped cautiously into the barn, her composure visibly shaken. For the first time, her icy demeanor cracked, revealing a flicker of genuine emotion, perhaps fear, perhaps awe. "These birds," she murmured, her voice trembling. "They're not just animals, are they?" Dr. Mathis seized the moment. "No, they're not. They're a marvel of nature, something we don't fully understand yet. And if you care at all about science, about discovery, you'll let them go." Cassandra hesitated, her gaze shifting between Jacob, the birds, and her guards. Finally, she exhaled sharply, her shoulders slumping. "Fine," she said, her tone laced with reluctance. "Take them. But don't think this is over." She turned on her heel and marched out of the barn, her guards following. The convoy departed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving Jacob and his team in stunned silence. A new home. The transport truck departed shortly after, carrying the black chickens to their new home at the research facility. Jacob watched it disappear down the road, his heart heavy yet hopeful. He knew it was the right decision, but the farm felt emptier without them. Over the next few weeks, Jacob adjusted to life without the birds. The farm, once bustling with activity, seemed quieter now, but it was also more peaceful. Dr. Mathis kept him updated on the birds' progress, sending pictures and reports that detailed their remarkable adaptations and behaviors. The research facility became a sanctuary for the birds, a place where they could thrive without interference. Their discovery sparked a wave of scientific interest, leading to breakthroughs in genetics, conservation, and even renewable agriculture. Jacob's journal, filled with his meticulous notes, became a cornerstone of the research, earning him recognition as a vital contributor. A legacy restored. Months later, Jacob stood in his fields, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold. The farm, once on the brink of collapse, was thriving again. Donations and sponsorships from conservation organizations had poured in, allowing Jacob to repair and modernize his operations. His story had inspired others, drawing attention to the importance of preserving the wonders of nature. As Max and Ruby played at his feet, Jacob smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. The black chickens had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. Though they were no longer on his farm, their legacy lived on. In science, in conservation, and in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by their story. And for Jacob, that was enough.